So this business was started by my grandfather, Charles Ora Plummer. He was a musician in his life. He was owner of a hardware store in Plainfield, Iowa. He was the head of city sanitation in Cedar Falls, Iowa for a while. And he started this business, and it was originally called Pioneer Manufacturing. And he started it with a fellow named Howard Rebholz, who at that time was the personnel director at Rath Packing Company. And the germ of the idea to make these arm guards probably came from the fact that Charles and Howard played in a band together. And I'm sure Howard regaled him with horror stories of what the fellows he saw come into his office had done to themselves with knives and saws and so on and so forth. So I'm sure that's where Charles got the idea to make something to protect these poor fellows. And he also had a next door neighbor that was a butcher that I'm sure told him similar stories. So that's the germ of an idea to make a plastic arm guard that would protect these guys from harm when they were doing their work. And it was originally called Pioneer Manufacturing. It started sometime in the early to middle 60s. I wouldn't know without looking up a patent date. But they made their arm guard, they patented it, and they started making it. And when they started making it, the plastic was expensive. It was so primitive at that stage that after they formed the arm guards, if they sat on a shelf for very long, they would literally turn yellow and start to crack, just from the process of heating and forming them. So it was kind of incumbent upon them whenever they made these things to sell them and get them out the door as quickly as they can. They were probably going to take a beating in the workplace anyway, but they were certainly going to probably fall apart after some time, just because once they'd been heated and formed, the plastic was literally changed. We don't have that problem now. Certainly plastic is a lot better, a lot cheaper, etc., etc. So that's how that started.
Why? Come on. Ow.
So the bandsaw basically comes into play for a couple of different things down there at the shop. The first was I used it to cut all the waste off the blanks I got, the trapezoid blanks that I got from Regal Plastic. I cut the waste off to make it easier to route, and also because after a while I struck a deal with them to be able to recycle all the pieces of plastic that I wasn't actually forming into arm guards, and it was a nice deal. That way it didn't get wasted, it didn't go to waste, it didn't go to landfills. I could get a little bit of a credit for it, and it would go back. The other thing, as you're seeing here, is that there was a certain type of arm guard I made called a hog header, and there were some sections of it that were just absolutely too hard to cut with a router. You could not get any form of router blade into those little areas, so those had to be cut by hand. That's literally one of the first things that I ever learned how to do from my grandfathers, is how to take a half dozen of those things, trace the template out on that piece of plastic, and cut them with a bandsaw, and do a nice job of it. Try to do as nice a job as you could so that you weren't having to sand all the bumps and mistakes and stuff like that off. And it took some practice, and it was also dangerous. I cut myself a few times. There's no getting around it, and I cut myself rather badly. And just about the time I would think that I was never going to cut myself again, I did, and I was actually lucky, because I could have cut myself much worse than I actually did. And I had to do some sanding. Those pieces that I cut out with a bandsaw, the edges had to be sanded, all the edges had to be sanded. The plastic that we got was unfinished plastic, which means it had a rough, sharp edge on it. We wanted to make sure that if we were delivering a commodity to somebody that was basically designed to keep them from getting cut in the workplace, the last thing we would do would be send them a piece of unfinished plastic and have the actual arm guard have an edge that might cut them, while they were wearing something that was designed to not allow them to be cut by any of the things that they were using. So certain of those arm guards that were cut out on the bandsaw, every edge had to be sanded, every single edge. And then some of the other things that were routed, if I wasn't happy with the routed edge, I would also take a sander to those and make sure that the edge was nice and smooth. The bead cutter that I used on the router usually did a pretty great job of putting a finished edge on 5 pieces at a time, but every once in a while it was a little rough, and you wanted that fixed. The process of forming an arm guard was basically the thing I did day in, day out for many, many, many years. My grandfather did it long before me. My dad did it for a while. But it was basically the process of putting 2 to 4 pieces of that finished plastic routed or hand cut arm guard into an oven. Basically the oven was about 225 degrees. You'd let it sit in there for about a minute until it was pliable, and then you would pull it out and you would throw it around to form. This first thing here that I was making is a hog header. It actually protected the fore and upper arm guard, and it needed a lip that would extend out, and when you wore it, that lip would protect the bicep. It was the only arm guard like that I made, but they were entirely handmade, hand cut. That form there is a form that my grandfather came up with from scratch. And then we'd put that over a funnel on the top of the oven that funneled heat into a little focused area, and you would take that, you would spin the end of the arm guard and heat the end of the arm guard, put your fingers inside it and form the lip. And that lip is what the chain glove that the meat packing guys would wear. They had a chain glove with a belt on it. The chain glove protected their hand. The belt was what went around that lip that I put on my arm guards. And the routing of the arm guards was the other thing that took up most of my time. Using that 5-bead cutter, which was actually designed to put a fine edge on the corners of furniture and would just kind of a fancy little touch or something like that, was something my grandfather also figured out, that if he took a clamp and he had some spacers, he could literally put a rounded edge on 5 arm guards at a time, which was obviously very time effective and so on and so forth. It put a very nice rounded edge on those things so that we didn't have to worry about a rough edged arm guard going into the marketplace and hurting anybody. The router table, the guard, everything like that, all those things were kind of thrown together by my grandfather. They made routers and router tables, but they were much too small for the application that we ended up using them for. So like everything else in that shop, we just kind of cobbled it together and made something. And I used basically the same stuff that my grandfather used when he started making these things. He came up with all this stuff trial and error. When I took over the business, I was basically too busy to ever try and even improve on it much. I could never afford better technology or better machines. You know, they have CNC machines that would do that stuff day in, day out, 24/7, 365, without anybody even needing to be around. But those machines were expensive. I could certainly never afford them, and I always reasoned that if I could afford one, then what the hell would I do? Sit around and babysit a machine instead of actually do something. But you can see that spinning router blade there puts a fine edge on 5 pieces of plastic at a time, and from there I could I could clean them up and throw them into the oven and make them. My grandfather literally would stamp his arm guards with the name Pioneer Manufacturing and the address and the zip code. He originally used an upside down clothes iron and designed a rubber stamp thing that would come down from above with an arm and literally stamp those things. That thing wore out fairly quickly. I did the next best thing. I went and found a fondue pot and ran a screw through the bottom of it, and that's how mine worked. And I would just literally put my hand on top of it and let the heat do the work.
That thing looks pretty old.
Yeah, it only gets 3 channels. It's an iMac. It runs QuickBooks Pro BC. Yeah, I had a famous local artist come in here and do some work for me. Decorate the place up a little bit. He did a nice job. Worked cheap. He's about 6 years old. I don't think I broke any child labor laws. I'm not sure. Yeah, I put this map of the U.S. up here, and then I used to put pins in wherever I had customers. And then a bird got in here one day and crapped all over it. Yeah, that's a typewriter. Don't ask.